All right, we can get started once again before judging the amount of seating we need. So just want to very quickly introduce our guest speaker tonight, Lee Jussim, the chair and distinguished professor of psychology at Rutgers University. So Lee's written a ton of stuff, and he can talk to you about that if you'd like. But academic interests in social perception and things of that nature, but really the topic of the talk today is about social science more broadly, and how we can do it better as academics, how we can do it better as students, how we can do it better as just regular consumers of what social science has to offer. So Lee's going to talk for 25, 30 minutes. I'll ask him some questions, and then we'll sort of open it up. So with that, I'd like to welcome Lee, and thanks for coming. And
Good to show the road.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for organizing this. Thank you all for coming out late on a Thursday night here. So my theme is right there. I'm going to be. Can you hear me in the back if I talk like this? Yes? Yeah? Okay. All right. Because I can talk louder, but if I don't have to, I won't. So. Okay. I probably will as I get rolling anyway. Okay. So, right. I'm going to argue that intellectual diversity, which I'll explain what I mean by that, is crucial to a strong and thriving, especially social science, but not restricted to social science. So I'm going to be arguing throughout this talk that intellectual diversity has these four major components: skepticism, theoretical diversity, demographic diversity, and political diversity. But before we get there, especially in academic contexts, diversity, the meaning of just the term diversity has kind of mutated. And so I went back to the dictionary to see how the word is defined. And this is what I discovered in Merriam-Webster: having or being composed of different things. I think I buy that. I think that's a pretty good definition of diversity. So then what is intellectual? Well, relating to the use of the intellect, well, what does that mean? The capacity for reflection and rational thought. I think that's pretty good too. So in that context, intellectual diversity means including people or ideas that are widely varying and yet not unhinged from reality, based on knowledge, evidence, logic, rational thinking, and the like. So what is knowledge? It's belief in things that are actually true, as opposed to just like other things. So at least that's how I'm using these terms. Other people might use them in different ways. That's how I'm using these terms. OK. So this very quickly gets to a problem for anyone advocating for intellectual diversity, which was sort of wonderfully captured by former New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. If knowledge has to be based on facts, who needs intellectual diversity, right? Because everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. So if science is all about generating new knowledge based on facts, what do you need intellectual diversity for? Just hone in on the facts. That's kind of the idea here. And my answer to that is no. Is an intellectual diversity obsolete? No. So that's kind of small. Can you see that over? That's probably kind of hard to see all the way in the back. I don't mind if you move up. I'll read it when it gets small. So Stephen Jay Gould was a very famous, very eminent, very influential evolutionary biologist. And he wrote about all sorts of things, including philosophy of science things. And he defined a scientific fact as here. Fact can only mean confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent. Okay, what the hell does that mean? So confirmed to such a degree means there's an abundance of evidence testifying to the truth of whatever claim is being made. So much so that it would be perverse. It would be ridiculous, colloquially speaking, to say, no, that's not true. To withhold, but it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent. Why? Because in science, no matter how well established some idea or claim is, there's always some chance that down the road, a new mountain of evidence is going to be produced saying, no, that was wrong. Now, until that is produced, it is perverse to withhold provisional assent. But no matter how well established something is, there's always some possibility, however remote, that it will be overturned. Okay, so that's what scientific fact means, and I think this is a good definition of scientific fact. So good that over the last couple of years in a couple of papers, we crafted our own corollary. I think this is a direct implication of Gould's definition. Anything not so well established that it would not be perverse to withhold provisional assent is not an established scientific fact. And I'm going to be drawing on that through much of the rest of this talk. So you may be some fancy pants scientist and produce some study and you publish it in some fancy journal, and you may think you've discovered some new scientific fact. And I can come along and say, well, not so fast. I don't buy it. I don't buy your study. You have not established, until you persuade enough people that know you were right all along, it's kind of interesting, but it doesn't rise to this level of scientific fact. Okay. And I'm going to lay out that logic here. Again, the key question here, isn't intellectual diversity rendered obsolete by the fact that we have to rely on facts? That's what science is all about to some degree. And here I'm going to argue the answer is no for 3 reasons. You may be wrong. You may think you know what the facts are. You may know you're right, as may I and somebody else. No matter how certain you are, sometimes you're going to be wrong. You may correctly know what the scientific consensus is around some issue, but the consensus may be wrong. I'll go through examples of that. And you and I may agree on the facts, and we may be right. Something is a fact. But one's interpretation of the meaning of that fact may be quite different for different people from different backgrounds. So I'm going to walk through examples of all 3 of these. We're not infallible. I mean, who here has never been wrong? Like, obviously, that's a rhetorical question. Everybody's been wrong about something sometime. So the fact that you could be wrong, you just look into your life that you've been wrong about something. So scientists are people. They're not immune to this. But I do have some real-world examples. Everybody and their brother, including social scientists, survey companies, predicted that Hillary would win the 2016 election. Nationally representative survey data. Who here has ever heard the term replication crisis? Raise your hand, raise your hand. Okay, so I am going to go into this a little bit, but who here has ever taken a psychology class? Who here is a psychology major? Really? Okay, so no one knows how much of whatever you've had in those classes are true. And the reason no one knows how much is true is over the last 5 or 6 years, this really started around 2011, 2012, some very famous, influential studies in psychology were unable to be replicated by other researchers. This prompted a renewed interest in replication. And since that time, there have been several hundred attempts at replicating psychology studies. About half succeed and about half fail. And as of this moment, it's not impossible. It's beyond the scope of this talk. I have an entire separate talk on this stuff. But it's hard to know it's hard to predict which are going to successfully replicate and which aren't. And if a finding is not replicable, if a claim is not replicable, it's not really clear that it was ever true in the first place. So this has produced this crisis within psychology. All people up in arms, and there's debates and arguments and all this kind of stuff, like what the hell are we going to do? Oh, we don't have to do anything. We're all fine. No, we're not fine, blah, blah, blah. That's the replication crisis. I don't know if you can see this in the back. So I'll just read the title. Voodoo correlations have the results of some brain scanning experiments been overstated? So these are fMRI studies. What a voodoo correlation is a correlation that's not really there. So that's neuroscience. And then there's this paper. Voodoo correlations are everywhere, not only in neuroscience. These are peer-reviewed articles. This is not like Vox or Fox News. These are peer-reviewed scientific articles with these titles. Papers in economics, well, this is a Science News type article. Papers in economics are not reproducible. That means if other economists try and recreate the findings, they can't do it often. This surgery, common knee surgery does little, why useless surgery is still popular. And then John Ioannidis is a biomedical researcher now at Stanford, was one of the earliest people to be at the forefront of highlighting the weaknesses and limitations to academic science. And he has, I think of this as his unholy trilogy. He's published a zillion articles. So again, I'm not sure if you can see the titles are enough. Why most published research findings are false. Why science is not necessarily self-correcting. Why most discovered true associations are inflated. Again, all of these are in peer-reviewed scientific literature. So the bottom line here, I'll stay here for now, is that we may think we know what the facts are, and yet we can be wrong. And not just you in your daily life, although that's surely true, as all of us are. Scientists are often wrong when they're conducting science. Okay. Continuing still with, your facts may be wrong in whole or part. You may have a fact, and you might be right. And anyone might acknowledge it. But it might be a selective fact, which means your understanding of whatever you're trying to understand may be incomplete, distorted, or biased, or inaccurate to some degree. It's a very simple example. This is a very, very famous study, came out, I don't know, a few years ago. Social science faculty's subtle gender biases favor male students. So this is about sexism in science. And it showed evidence of sexism in science. This is a well-conducted study. I have no doubt that they found what they say they found. And so if you know about this study, you know about sexism and something about sexism in science. And you would be, if you're talking about the study and you know the study reasonably well, you would have a fact at your disposal. But then this study came out a couple of years later. National hiring experiments revealed 2-to-1 faculty preference for women on STEM tenure track jobs. The study was also a well-conducted study. It has facts at its disposal. My only point would be that if you know about one, but not the other, in either direction, your understanding of the facts are selective. And therefore, your conclusions are likely to be not fully true to the evidence. Colloquially speaking, inaccurate to some degree. Okay. So if ideas have to be based on facts, is intellectual diversity obsolete? No. You may be wrong. I may be wrong. Science may be wrong. Okay. What about this consensus issue? You hear this all the time, especially in climate issues. The consensus around what the facts are may itself be wrong in whole or in part. So you may be right about the consensus. You and I may understand the consensus completely, but the consensus itself may be wrong. Science is littered with invalid consensus. The history of science is filled with these sort of invalid consensuses. So for centuries, scientists believed the Earth was the center of the universe. The Earth is clearly not the center of the universe. For centuries, there was a belief in the young Earth. The Earth was thousands of years old and millions of years old. Now it's billions of years old. For centuries, doctors treated all sorts of illnesses by bleeding the patients, making them bleed. I know this kind of sounds, you're not familiar with this. This kind of sounds wacky, but this was, the premier medical practice for a very long time. My guess is this might be news to some of you. Stress doesn't cause ulcers. So there were, for decades long, there was a whole biomedical pharmaceutical complex around the notion that stress causes ulcers. Bacteria cause ulcers. The guy who discovered that won the Nobel Prize. So if you follow science news at all, what you will, it's pretty easy to find this. Periodically, scientists discover animals long believed to be extinct. So for decades, centuries, scientists thought some animal was extinct, and then, off of Madagascar or some sea cave, they find a fish that they thought died out 300 million years ago. And as I mentioned, we have psychology's replication crisis, which is showing that lots of things we once thought were true in psychology are probably not true. Okay, so science is filled with examples where the consensus around the facts turned out not to be true. And then the last of these that I'm going to hit is the facts we all may agree on the facts. You may say it's a fact, and I say, yeah, that actually is a fact, but we may interpret the same fact differently. So I have an entire paper on this. I'm not going to go into all these details, but this goes into case after case in social and cognitive psychology where some study was conducted and it just reached the wrong conclusions. And you could see that it reached the wrong conclusions from its own data. But I'll just give a very simple example here, where we all might agree on the fact, and yet the fact may be open to multiple interpretation. So for example, and you see this all the time in all sorts of ways. There may be some gender gap in some field. It may be in hiring. It may be in college admissions. It may be in health. It could be in kind of anything. So one possible interpretation, one explanation for that gap would be sex discrimination. That one, men or women are favored or disfavored in that context. But another might be differences in interests. So if men and women have different occupational interests, they will also differentially sort themselves into different occupations. So the existence of a gap by itself is not evident. I mean, it could reflect discrimination. That's possible. But it also could reflect something else. Okay, so have the fact, different possible interpretations. So the bottom line here is that, no, this Moynihan thing, however, I'm with that. People are entitled to their opinions. They're not entitled to their own facts. But it doesn't render obsolete my call for intellectual diversity as a source of strong science. Okay, so that's like refuting the negative, right? So this is one reason you might think this is not true. And I think, no, you should. This is the very bad reason for thinking this is not true. But I haven't really given any reason for you to believe that intellectual diversity actually has some benefits. So I'm now going to make that case. Again, I have these 4 components of intellectual diversity: skepticism, theoretical diversity, demographic diversity, and then political diversity. So first, skepticism. There is a long tradition in philosophy and sociology of science arguing that skepticism is a central component of strong science. So Karl Popper was a philosopher of science, writing in the middle of the 20th century for the most part, really emphasized falsification. It goes back to the 1930s. I'm not sure if you can see the bottom quote here. Science must begin with myths and with the criticism of myths. And what Popper really emphasized was the need for and attempts to falsify scientific theories, claims, and hypotheses. So to me, that's a manifestation of skepticism. Yes, here's my theory, and look how beautiful and wonderful my theory is. No, that's ridiculous. Okay, that's what falsification. No, we're now going to show why that's not true. That's what falsification is. It's inherently skeptical. Okay, so Popper is not the end-all or the be-all of the philosophy of science. My only point is that this tradition of skepticism runs very deep in science, and some people would argue that the ability to falsify a theory or a hypothesis is what makes it scientific. And then Robert Merton was one of the most eminent sociologists of the 20th century, explicitly argued that that there were four norms that characterized the conduct of science that gave science the sort of heightened credibility that led science to deserve the heightened credibility that it got in the wider society. And one was what he called organized skepticism. And this is a quote from his writing on this. Another feature of the scientific attitude is organized skepticism. Involves a latent questioning of certain bases of routine, authority, vested procedures in the realm of the sacred. Right? So what skepticism meant for Merton was, as a community, science rigorously challenges claims to new discoveries or claims to understand some phenomena. Now, why does this, so this is another pillar of the sort of intellectual tradition. So why does it work? Why does skepticism have this value to science? When claims are subject to a skeptical test, there's really only a few things that will matter, that will happen, could happen. The original claim might emerge unscathed. It's like, no, here's some study, it found such and such. Someone comes along and says, no, that's a horrible study. So I'm going to do the study way better. And it's like, well, it's still possible that it was right in the first place. And so now that we did the study way better, we get the same result. So that's one possibility, that when subject to a skeptical test, the original claim will emerge intact and even more convincing. Another possibility is that the original claim will have been shown to have been wrong. It's like, well, when it's done right, you don't get that finding. And yet another possibility, which again leads science to hone in more progressively towards truths, is that, well, there might be something in between. That is, maybe the first thing was not completely right, but maybe it wasn't completely wrong either. And when we do it better, when we challenge it, we have better methods. There's ways or conditions under which that thing is true, even though it was not quite as true as first claimed. Okay, so there's a lot of reason to believe that psychology's replication crisis, which I think is more than just an issue of replication, so I call it the validity crisis here, can be viewed as emerging from insufficient skepticism. So psychologists would publish these studies with all these weaknesses and flaws that should have been obvious, but weren't obvious, and so were treated as these amazing new discoveries. So this is one of the early science reform articles that came out of that. And the key is what's after without going into all the sort of details here, the key is what's after the colon, right? Undisclosed flexibility in data collection and analysis allows presenting anything as significant. So the argument that these researchers were making was that basically by cooking the books, psychologists could tell almost any story they wanted. And they argued that there was way more book cooking than anyone had ever dreamed. Actually, in this particular study, this particular paper, what they showed with real data was that using techniques that were common in psychology up to that time, that listening to the Beatles reduced people's age. Yes, you should be laughing. Right? Age doesn't go backwards. With real data, they showed that listening to the Beatles reduces people's age. That's impossible. And it raised the sort of questions about, well, if our normal methods are capable of showing something blatantly impossible, how many other completely bogus findings were there in the literature? Right, so we have this paper, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, where we lay a lot of this out. It's on scientific gullibility. it's like one thing for, okay, so you're an undergraduate in an intro psych class and your professors are telling you something's true. Well, of course you're going to believe it. Like, what, you don't really have much choice. But why did scientists believe this stuff? That's the question. Anyway, so we go through this in this paper. I could do a whole talk on sort of why scientists believe all these sort of incredible things. But without, this is going to be really small. This is just a list. As much as possible, you know, I hope, middle row, can you read that? Can you guys read that? No, all right, so I'll just read a few of these. This is just a list of things just in my home discipline of social and personality psychology that over the last like 10 years or so have been shown to either be completely false, dubious, that is, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, no one really knows, probably not, misrepresented or overstated, right? So I'll just read a couple, but and this is an incomplete list. I could have gone on for 4 slides with this stuff. Okay, so, and you don't need to know, a lot of you are not psychologists, some of these are buzzwordy terms in psychology, you're not going to know what they are. That's not the point. The point is, there's a lot of this. That's the point. So I'll just read a couple. Stereotype threat eliminates racial achievement gaps. Having people thinking about being old causes them to walk slower. Power of the situation is larger than the power of the individual. Climate skeptics believe bizarre conspiracy theories. I'm just going to walk down a little bit. Implicit prejudice powerfully predicts discrimination. Smiling makes you feel happier. And it just goes on and on. Like, these are all things that were, you know, canonical. They were the things that appeared in undergraduate textbooks, in the outlets of record in psychology as, oh my God, look at these amazing things we have discovered. And it's turning out to be kind of like not so much. So if you're interested, if you find any of this interesting at all, I have an active blog series on Psychology Today where I write about this kind of stuff all the time. That way I don't have to go into a whole talk on this stuff here, but you know, are most published social psychology findings false? What is wrong with social psychological science? This is just tip of the iceberg. I do stuff like this all the time. So if you find this interesting, you know, you can see it, find it easily on Psych Today. Okay, so that's skepticism. What about theoretical diversity? So in the social sciences, when we use the term theory, we're usually talking about mini theories. You know, we're not talking about relativity or the theory of evolution, which are these like big sort of all-encompassing theories in physics or biology. We have like little theories, you know, like attitudes cause behavior. There's actually a mini theory. And I'm just going to walk through a single example of a case where theoretical diversity would have been exceedingly useful to figure out something decades earlier than we actually figured it out. So the question I'm going to address here is, are conservatives especially biased in their evaluations of scientific evidence? So to get at that question, over 50 years ago, a biologist actually laid out the sort of logic of what he called strong inference. What strong inference refers to is not just, you know, I have some pet theory and I go out and I try and find evidence for it. No. You identify theories that lead to conflicting or alternative predictions and you pit them against each other. And Platt argued that by doing that, you very quickly kind of separate the wheat from the chaff and can figure out which theories really hold true. Okay, so for decades, for a very long time, the psychological literature was sort of filled with this one-sided claim that people on the right are more biased in their evaluations of evidence than people on the left. You can think of that as a one-sided claim or a one-sided hypothesis. How biased are conservatives? Are conservatives more biased than liberals? But you can imagine that as a two-sided question. Who is more biased in their evaluations of evidence, liberals or conservatives? And it turns out that even though it took decades to get to the answer, the most recent answer, the best answer, is that bias is about equal. And this is from a major meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a sort of fairly sophisticated technique that takes results from lots of different studies and combines them. So these were studies of the role of political biases in evaluations of evidence. And I'm just going to read, if I can see it on my computer, the highlighted conclusion. Mean overall partisan bias was robust, and there was strong support for the symmetry hypothesis. That is, liberals and conservatives showed no difference in mean levels of bias across studies. In other words, liberals and conservatives are about equally biased in their evaluations of the scientific evidence that social scientists have studied so far. Now, there may be limitations to that evidence, right? This almost harks back in some ways to Gould withhold provisional assent, right? If there's some problem with the evidence, I think many of us would still be open to the conclusion that conservatives were more biased than liberals, or liberals were more biased than conservatives. But so far, based on scores of studies, bias is about equal. OK. So what about, so that's skepticism, theoretical diversity. What about demographic diversity? So you hear a lot about demographic diversity in college campuses. Usually, the argument has to do with some sort of social justice issue, historical discrimination, obstacles, past discrimination. That's a different issue here, though. The issue here is the role of demographic diversity in producing quality science. And Douglas Medden was president of the Association for Psychological Science, I don't know, 10 years or so ago, and wrote this column making what I think is a fairly compelling case for why demographic diversity actually is important for quality science, central to the enterprise of science itself. Validity in the sciences includes issues such as the choices of what to study, and people from different backgrounds are often going to choose different kinds of things to study. And especially this latter point, which I think is dead on right, sociology of science tends to converge on accuracy when really what they're arguing is when people with different biases or with different errors challenge each other, cancel each other out of which the truth is more likely to emerge. So I think that's also true. People from different demographic backgrounds are likely to have different biases. They play themselves out especially in politicized topics, but in certainly many social science topics. The playing out of those biases, however imperfect the humans are, but by having alternative biases in play, much like Platt's comparing alternative theories, the truth is more likely to emerge. And then they argue this, that developing a robust epistemology of science, that is, how does science know what it knows, is enhanced when students learn that knowledge in science is contested. Knowledge in science is contested. It's not some like pedestal thing. Yeah, I mean, I know you got to get through your classes, and there are right or wrong answers, and you got to give the damn right answers to the professor, right? Like that's how it works. But that's not how science works. Not most of the time. I mean, sometimes there are right or wrong answers. But at the frontiers of science, no one knows what the right or wrong answers are. That's why they're doing the research. If we knew, we wouldn't need to do the research now, would we? Right. It's contested. OK. On top of that, so that's on the demographic diversity among scientists. This is a very famous paper in psychology called The Weirdest People in the World. Weird is actually an acronym. It's a play on words. And it stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And the reason that acronym is central to this paper is that those are overwhelming, right? Psychology is dominated by North America and Europe. So we mostly study North Americans and Europeans who are, relative to the rest of the world, well, by definition, Western, on average, much more highly educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now, why is that important? Amazingly, this paper shows that in all sorts of ways, people from other backgrounds function psychologically quite differently than Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people, even at the level of things like visual perception. It's like, this is an amazing paper. So in addition to the importance of demographic diversity on the scientist side, because people bring different backgrounds, perspectives, and different biases to bear, even at the people we study side, it is clear that psychology needs, if it wants to reach generalizable conclusions about people, it needs to study people far more demographically diverse than we have been doing for most of my career. Okay. Now, skepticism, theoretical diversity, demographic diversity, and now I'm ready to hit political diversity, which I'm going to argue is also important. So political diversity is important for sort of the logic underlying the importance of political diversity is almost identical to that underlying demographic diversity. People from different ideological or political perspectives are often fairly hostile towards each other and the other side, right? I mean, this is like, if you don't realize it, you haven't been paying attention, right? Especially the last 4, 5, 6 years, partisanship in the United States has gotten very, very intense. People hate each other, right? So you have a lot of this going on. So, but now, okay, so that's like in the wider political world. I'm making a scientific argument here. And how does that play itself out here? Well, if you are ideologically predisposed for or against some conclusion, particularly against some conclusion, you are far more likely to be skeptical of that conclusion and hold that conclusion to a much higher standard of evidence before you're willing to accept it. That's a good thing. If you buy the rest of my argument, that is a good thing. If skepticism does what I just argued it does, if you want to have a thriving science, at least a thriving science that addresses, as the social sciences do, address politicized issues, you want your ideological opponents in there, not because you like them, not because they're nice, not because you respect their values. You need their skepticism, which you are not going to get from people who share your ideological views most of the time. In much the same idea, conservatives and liberals, people on the left or right, plays itself out in different parts of the world, think about things differently and are likely and often do develop different theoretical perspectives on human psychological functioning. So what do you get from that? You get theoretical diversity. And then Medin and Lee's arguments for demographic diversity hold true exactly here. You have people who ask different questions from each other, who have they're biased, but they have opposing biases. If Medin and Lee were right about opposing biases working for demographic diversity, there's no reason not to think they wouldn't work for political diversity. And so the idea is you get to better conclusions, better epistemology, and again, students get to see science being contested. The problem is, and you probably can't see these data, the social sciences in the United States are almost entirely left. So, this sounds like something you would hear like on some Fox News nutcase saying something like, but it's actually literally true. There are about 10 times as many people in the social sciences in the US, there's about 40, 50% here, who self-identify as radicals, the columns read radical activist or Marxist, as conservative. About 10 times as many radicals, activists, and Marxists as conservatives. The number of self-identified conservatives is about 5% or less. It's 19 out of 20, or 1 out of 20, which means there's very, very few there. Especially when you go on the coasts, there's even fewer. Okay, so there is no political diversity, especially in the social sciences and humanities. And this is sort of an uphill sell, right? Because usually I'm giving this talk to academics, and academics, are people who, right, are all left and lacking this ideological diversity. But I'm going to try to argue for at least one additional selling point. So you have all the other stuff: skepticism, theoretical diversity, the demographic diversity arguments. if there was greater ideological diversity in the academy, the academy would have a better shot at influencing policymakers, and because we would have greater credibility with policymakers. So why would that work? It would work because when, might be harder to reach consensus, right? Because you have these dueling biases which would have to fight it out. But when a scientific or a social scientific consensus was reached with a more ideologically diverse academy, what that would mean is that someone on your side, no matter which side you're on, is saying, no, this is really true. It doesn't really matter what your ideology is. This is really true. And when someone on your side is saying this is really true, it's way easier to accept than when it's only people on the other side saying this is really true. It's far easier to dismiss the academy, the social sciences, as just sort of left-wing ideological hacks if the academy is filled with nothing but people who have left-wing ideology. It's very easy for people on the right to say, no, this is all bogus. This is all just ideology masquerading as science. Whereas if there was this consensus that included people on both sides, it's far, far more difficult to dismiss this as it's just a bunch of ideological hacks. OK. So I think I'm actually done there. That's the my main theme here is that intellectual diversity is not a single thing. It's diverse, and it has at least these 4 components. Thank you. Yep.
All right, so in the interest of time, just have a couple of quick questions and open it up. The first one is, so the demographic diversity thing, I like the weird example is perfect, right? We study rich white people, so we know a lot about rich white people. Give me an example of a finding in social psychology or whatever that was bad or persisted too long because there wasn't enough political diversity in the room. Like show me how this,
among the scientists or among the subjects?
Among the scientists in this case.
Oh, I mean, I think this just happens all the time. So, sure. So the social sciences have been declaring stereotypes to be inaccurate for over 100 years. And I do research on stereotypes, stereotype biases. And when I first started doing this in the 80s, I'm like, OK, I want to get to the bottom of this. Like, where is the evidence for this? And what I discovered was a black hole. This is a whole separate talk. But when social scientists, so in scientific writing, in peer-reviewed journals, a statement of fact requires evidence. And there's 2 different ways you can produce the evidence. You can cite an article that provided the evidence, or you could produce the evidence yourself. But if you have neither one of those, you are making shit up. OK, what I discovered was that almost all the time, when social scientists declared stereotypes to be inaccurate, they were making shit up. Now, how did I do that? 1, it's very simple. If you look at the article, stereotypes are widely known to be inaccurate, or whatever the statement is. Question 1, is there a citation? Are they referencing any evidence? Half the time the answer is no. They're just stating it. It's fake news before fake news was a thing. OK, now the other half of the time, there would be a reference there. There would be some citation, Smith and Jones, 1963. To say, OK, now I can get to the bottom of this. So I would track down Smith and Jones. When I tracked down Smith and Jones, do you know what I found? No evidence whatsoever. There was just no evidence. Sometimes Smith and Jones wasn't even about the accuracy of stereotypes. It was like some other topic. Sometimes Smith and Jones also declared stereotypes to be inaccurate without a reference. Now, why was this going on? I don't really know for sure, but going back 100 years, social scientists have had a strong social justice orientation, especially if you think about America 100 years ago. We had Jim Crow and just all sorts of horrible stuff, right? And so the justification for inequality and discrimination was sort of very strong in the society, and the social scientists wanted to do something about that. And this sort of rhetoric around the inaccuracy of stereotypes was kind of useful for that purpose. It's like, okay, well then aren't we good? Well, no, because scientists can't be in the business of making shit up for political purposes. You can have whatever politics you want. You want to work to cure inequality or overcome oppression, that's fine. But don't act as if something is true unless you have the evidence for it. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, cool. And just one last one for me. So, skepticism, great, okay? But what I'm sort of worried about is we're not in like a pro-science mood as a country. And so how do we have healthy skepticism? And you're right, a lot of the stuff, we talk about implicit bias and discrimination stuff, there's a lot of just bad underneath there. But how do we not throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, hey, look, they're just all making, I'm not going to be skeptical, I don't have the energy for this, they're just all making stuff up, I'm going to believe what I want to believe. How do we carefully investigate the bad while also realizing, hey, look, there are some things that we do know, and let's not forget that.
Right. So I am, I don't know, buoyed to some degree with respect to this by the paper that came out about a year or two ago, in which the researchers were teaching psychology. And if I remember, I'm doing this from memory, I may not have this exactly right, but they had two different classes, two different psych classes. One in which they taught the replication crisis, like kind of like I gave a short overview here, but they did one or two full classes on studies that don't replicate and bad methods and the whole thing. And in the other class, they didn't do it. They did a very traditional psychology class. And at the end of that, so they have this sort of experiment. They ran this experiment in psychology classes, asking, well, what is the effect of teaching undergraduates about the replication crisis? Does it undermine the credibility and belief in psychology, or does it do something else? And the answer was actually both. So at the end, there were two main outcomes. One was, how much do you believe the results of psychological studies? That went down. That's the correct response. It should have gone down, right? But the second question asked them to rate how similar psychology was to physics, and that went up after they taught about the replication crisis. Because learning, almost exactly like Medin and Lee were arguing, learning about how science works and about how scientific ideas and claims are contested by scientists actually improves the credibility of science. That's not a complete answer, but that's an answer I feel pretty good about.
Okay. Cool. Questions from the audience. I can keep going, but if anyone wants to jump in, now's the time. No one likes to go first.
Okay, as an old guy.
The older I get, the more I like old guys.
Well, back in the day, I pretty much believed everything. and I still hope there are flying saucers and Sasquatch because we do need monsters. But I tend to think maybe not. With skepticism, though, at what point, and because I consider myself a skeptic, I tend to question everything now, except my wife.
God forbid.
Yeah, that's it. At what point do you live your life accepting certain things? Is there, in your life, do you walk down the street saying, there's a red light, you're driving up to a red light going, that thing isn't really red, it's green, or it's yellow. How does skepticism affect your life?
Okay, so most of what I'm talking about here is stuff at the frontiers of science, right? I mean, this desk is here. Like, if I tried to walk through it, I would get hurt, right? So in the day-to-day life, I mean, it's just, you know.
There were studies about walking through walls.
No, I know there were. That's right. There's Uri Geller and all that. It did not work. That's exactly right. Right. You know, so you drive down here, I'm going over bridges. My default assumption is the bridge is not going to collapse. The bridge is actually there. So there is this immediate sensory stuff, but that's very different than these sort of deep, complex, causal inferences that underlie a lot of psychology and sociology. You know, so another example of sort of the political infection of social science, in my opinion, is the surprising 2016 election result has spawned a slew of social science studies trying to figure out what the hell happened. The go-to explanation is sexism and racism. There was this rise and collection of sexists and racists all moved over to create this wave for Trump. And I'm convinced that there is a role for sexism and racism in the election. But it's just not the whole story. It's not only not the whole story, it's probably not even most of the story. Now, in a really close election, everything matters. So, that there was this sort of, that Trump drew people who might be particularly racist or sexist into, to voting when they might not have otherwise voted. There's probably some justification for that. But I think what I would call it, this obsession with racism and sexism on the left has led leftist social scientists to be largely blind, to all sorts of other influences on the election. So in the close states, which Pennsylvania was one of the close states, you had lots of people who voted for Obama flipping to vote for Trump. That's prima facie evidence against racism being this huge role.
I think, can I just interject?
Yeah.
Because I was very involved for 18 years, I was involved in politics very, very deeply. And I'm not anymore, I'm a skeptic. But in 2006, Lynn Swan, who is a black man, ran for governor in Pennsylvania. And he won the center part of the state, which is the most white conservative part of Pennsylvania. I went to, after he had lost the election, I went to Harrisburg for a press. The press was kind of reviewing the election. And when I brought this up, the journalist said to me, I said, how do you explain this, that these conservative white people in the middle of the state voted overwhelmingly for a black man? And they said, not enough of them voted for the black man. That shows they're racist. And I just... Right,
it's mind-blowing. It's mind-boggling. So, but the topic here is, I think that's right. I think that the analysis rings true. It's very similar to the little story I just told about Trump and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's just, so I'm skeptical. And a lot of again, there's probably a core that's true in that analysis, but it's overblown. So that's very different than driving over bridges or bumping into tables. That's really my main point.
Intro-American students, what drives presidential election results? Yeah.
What was that?
What drives presidential election results?
Incumbency and the economy.
Yes, thank you. That's the answer.
What was the answer?
What was the first part?
We're old, we're deaf. Incumbency and...
Oh, incumbency and the economy.
And what? Incumbency
Incumbency and the economy.
Oh, economy.
Thanks. You pass.
Hi there. I really appreciate your talk. Motivated to take a look at the paper and read it more clearly. In the spirit of skepticism, I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the empirical and mostly quantitative sort of data that you presented in favor of your argument, given in light of the first piece that suggests that most social science research is of questionable replicability. Why should I believe the pieces that you presented to demonstrate your argument that you kind of undid it in the opening? Maybe there's criteria for selecting those pieces, but peer review, all those other pieces were probably peer reviewed before they came out in the APA, and So help me understand what the criteria for a believing game might be that clearly you're using for the data that you pulled to support the other tenets of your argument.
So I think the only real data I presented was the ideological distribution. I don't think I presented any. Did I present any other data? Oh yeah, I mean, I cited a couple of the papers, right? The meta-analysis and stuff, right? Yes, yeah. Well, first place, no. Let me encourage your skepticism. Just because I presented it, that doesn't mean anything, right? So the ideological bias meta-analysis is new. It only came out within the last year or so. So in absolute fairness, it hasn't really been fully vetted yet, right? And so maybe it won't hold up. I mean, we won't know for a long time whether it actually holds up. Or maybe, and there's ways in which it might, maybe they did something wrong. Maybe they did the meta-analysis badly. Maybe when someone else tries to reproduce it, they get a completely different result. No one has tried yet, so we don't really know. Or let's say the meta-analysis is pristine. They did a beautiful job. The result totally holds up, but it's contingent on the underlying studies that were conducted. Maybe those studies were imperfect. Maybe even if the studies were good, maybe they were a biased sample of the ways liberals and conservatives think, and when someone comes up with a better way of tapping into that, we get a different result. That's all completely reasonable. I'm just going to stop there.
But then how do we not go back to saying screw it, the earth is flat? What? What is?
So.
Okay. Let me put it slightly different way, right? So maybe the studies are correct, but there is some theoretical reason supported by some evidence to think that having everyone in the same room believing the same thing leads to results that might be more quickly consensually accepted by everyone than not, right? And so can I believe that without necessarily having to go to a meta-analysis to see how this works in particular places? Is there a place we could start before we start digging into the particulars?
I'm not sure I'm following the question, actually.
So why? Press better. What is the grounds to believe that political diversity matters as opposed to the grounds to believe that, hey, look, we just have the most qualified people becoming social scientists and they're doing quality work that's honest, and so maybe we shouldn't trust them, but there's no reason to think that the underlying issue is a problem.
Right. So first place, there is, when I give talks like this, I am at risk of conveying the impression that you can't believe anything. I don't think that's actually true. I mean, I think there is, there are real questions about what can and cannot be believed. But when again, it depends on what your conclusion wants to be. If you're talking about people in the United States, there is ample work done with nationally representative samples. So that kind of solves the representativeness problem. And then typically it solves the sample size problem. So one of the key problems that has led to the replication crisis in psychology was that people were conducting studies based on these tiny little samples of college students. 10, 12, 14, 20 people. This sounds nuts, but which is why I wrote a paper on scientific gullibility. Who is believing things based on studies of 20 or 30 people? This is just make my head explode. Okay, so, but there is lots of other research that is based on thousands of people and nationally representative samples of thousands of people. And it is vividly clear that some people, not everyone is particularly ideological. I mean, I think people who are highly educated, people in the academy, are more likely to have strong partisan politics than like your average American citizen. Although there's plenty of ideology out there also, but it tends to be elevated in a university context. But the more committed, and there's just great evidence for this, the more committed and extreme people are to an ideological perspective, the more distorted their perceptions of the opponent. Of the opposing theory. And my opinion that, this is experiments, it's nationally representative data, it all sort of converges on a conclusion. I mean, I guess that's my answer to your underlying question, is when you have, there's a whole nother set of answers, but when you have converging evidence using a variety of methodologies from a variety of perspectives that essentially say the same thing, that to me rises to Gould's description of scientific fact. That is, okay, like it could all be wrong, but you really got to come up with the data showing it's wrong before I believe it's going to be wrong. So and the evidence for ideological bias in general in life, not just academics, is very, very strong, in my opinion.
Could I ask a practical question about the last of the points that you made? Provisionally, if we accept that this is a good idea, let's have some political diversity, ideological diversity in the social sciences. Here's some challenges to that, and practical, which I'm sure you're aware of them, but I'll put them out there and verbalize them anyway, and you can tell me what you think about how you would meet these. Now, plenty of anecdotal evidence and some experimental evidence too indicates that people typically, and I think this is true of social scientists too, they're not very good at the game that science involves of debate and let's fight it out. Let's have an antagonistic match here to see who's got the right answer, and let's sort of go at. We like to be on teams. We like to get along with each other. We don't use this term to talk about, but we like groupthink at a certain level. It's comforting. It makes us feel good in a lot of ways. It's much less troubling than having to constantly defend your position against antagonistic opponents. So given if you're right about what the ideological demography of the social sciences looks like, and I think there's a lot of evidence, you cited some of it, that indicates that you are, what's the likelihood you're going to be able to do anything about that, given that, again, I mean, anecdotally, I know tons of social scientists who show no interest in any of that. They're perfectly happy with where things are. Some of them even who accept that, yeah, you might be right. It creates a little bit of a bias, but whatever. I'm having a good time hanging out with my colleagues and people who are not here.
Yeah, so as sort of sociology of science, I think everything you just said is exactly right. So sociology of science, sort of description about how scientists interact with each other in scientific groups and interact with the wider society, right? So that's what you just described, and I think that's right. So, but it's not the only thing. As a general, yes. So I mean, this very quickly gets into sort of dysfunctional academic incentives, right? So academic scientists are not primarily incentivized to get things right. We are incentivized to publish and to get grants. Now, no one really cares whether what we publish is actually true or not. And, well, I would do a whole thing on grants also. So what this creates is, I would argue that this creates almost like exactly what you're describing, this sort of groupy, almost guildy mentality. We're all in this together. We all want to kind of give each other a leg up, right? So it's not that there aren't debates and conflicts and sometimes sort of really visceral hostility, but for the most part, we want to advance our interests. We want to advance our careers. We want to get our next grant. We want to get our stuff published. We want our book published. If we can, get an editorial in the New York Times. Now we have a best-selling book, right? It's a gig, right? It's just this like sort of log rolling gig. Okay, so that's my version of the problem that you just described. I think that's right. However, in addition to that, in my experience, now I'm talking from experience, I'm not talking from data. given the dubiousness of data, the uncertainty of data over the last 5 or 7 years, I have come to think, not just my personal experiences, but expert experience, the difference between that and hard data is much smaller than I used to think 20 years ago. Okay, in that context, I have found that there are, I'm thinking of psychologists now. I'm beyond, this is probably true beyond psychologists, but from experience, I can really primarily talk about psychologists who actually do care about finding things that are true. And they care about that. We all have to manage our careers. If you're not tenured, you want to get tenure. You're right. Even if you are tenured, you want to get a promotion. Everyone has these incentives that are not directly connected to finding things that are true. We have lives, we have families, we want to do well by them. This is the human condition that we're living under. Nonetheless, along with all that, there are people who, even when they disagree with you a lot, actually care more about finding, in their professional scientific lives, care more about finding things that are actually true. So I'm going to actually go back up here and just tell a little story. About 2 years ago, I had a debate at UMass Amherst with a guy, on the topic of implicit racial bias. This is unconscious racial prejudice. And as you might imagine, I was deeply skeptical of everything that has been done on that up until that time. In fact, my original version of this included about 7 slides on that. It's like, okay, this is just going to go too long, so I took it all out, but it's there in the background. And he was like, no, these things are important and more powerful than I was suggesting. So we had this, it was a completely civil, it was really an interesting and fun debate. He was thoughtful, articulate, he made good points. He wasn't like, nobody bit my head off, nobody bit his head off. And at the end of that, we're sitting around talking, and we agreed to engage in an adversarial collaboration. So an adversarial collaboration is when you have 2 people who take a different theoretical view, different view of some set of literature, and work together in a very Platt-like, strong inference kind of way to figure out what's going on. So the reason I put this back up is this study has tons of limitations. In some ways it was quite good, but it has tons of limitations. What we agreed we would work together on is trying to replicate this study. And that's in progress. We haven't conducted it yet, but we hope to. So that's, I have other examples like that, but that story, I hope, conveys the fact that there are, despite all these incentives and the gilded nature of what we do and the sort of log rolling gig, and despite all that, there are at least some people who actually care enough about actually finding the truth to do things that maximize our chances of doing that.
Hi. So yeah, you're talking right now about incentives in academia, how to publish or what to publish. You're also talking about political diversity, demographic diversity. You talked about the replication crisis, and you did mention all these studies that have like a sample of 20, and they're all 20 college students, and then based on that, some conclusions are reached. So it seems like most of the replication crisis comes with just crappy methodology. So we can have all the political diversity you want. I can make my crappy study, publish my results. Somebody that completely disagrees with me can do their crappy study, publish their results that are completely the opposite of mine. If we're all doing crappy science, we can have all the diversity of opinions and our ideas and theories and of demographics. It's still crappy study after crappy study, right? So how does all of these help us if we're all doing crappy science? Because as you said, nobody cares if we're right or wrong. They care if we publish, right? Like you can even hear in the language they say productive.
Yeah.
Productive research.
That's right. That's exactly.
Units of research.
Yeah.
So that's how it works. And I mean, I think you agree with that, I'm sure.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Those are the current incentives.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
how do we
absolutely.
get rid of those incentives? Because it seems to me that we even go as far as you follow those incentives long enough, most of us will forget how to do science. Generationally, eventually, nobody will know how to do proper science because nobody's encouraging you to do the proper science.
Okay.
How do we get rid of this?
How do we get rid of all this? So the first part of what you're saying is actually true, and I think is actually the first part, that we need to get the methods and practices to be improved. And I think that's actually happening. So the sample sizes in psychological studies have been going up over the last 10 years or so. So that was one of the worst weaknesses, and that does actually seem to be getting better. There were all sorts of other things, and again, it would take too long, but there are other practices that are slowly being implemented more and more widely that I think are improving the quality of psychological research. So, for example, this is a very simple one. Until very recently, psychologists would conduct studies and the data would just disappear. You know, if you're, it doesn't matter. Well, hypothetically, you're a psychologist, you publish some paper, I want to look at the data, I email you for the data. The most likely thing is you don't even reply. If you do reply, your reply is I'll get back to you, and then you don't get back to me. This next most likely reply is, oh, I did that study years ago, I don't know where the data are. So no one can reproduce anything. And it was like that for most of my career. It's much more common now for published articles to have links to the actual underlying data. So again, it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't all of a sudden make everything wonderful, but it's another improvement. So there's a whole sort of toolbox of these improvements that are in progress. And I'm actually more optimistic now than I was 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, it was just, I didn't know all the ways it was a disaster, but I knew it was bad, but there was no movement to do anything about it. But in the last 10 years or so, there really has been a movement that has been fairly effective at improving some of these practices. So that's on the, so yes, the political stuff doesn't even come in until the studies are at least reasonably high quality. So I completely agree with that. Your final question, though, is what do we do about the dysfunctional incentives? Right? That was sort of your key question, was what do we do about the bad incentives? And my answer is, I have no clue. I don't know. I mean, this idea that many of these dysfunctions come from bad incentives has been in this sort of science reform literature for a long time. It's bad incentives. It's not only bad incentives, but the incentives are bad. We're not rewarded for producing things that are actually true. But no one I know has come up with an alternative incentive system. And you're dealing with institutions, right? I mean, changing institutional practices is really, really tough. I mean, let's say you and I came up with some brilliant idea that, so we're going to reward people on the number of times others have successfully replicated their research. We're going to give them a raise. We're going to go to the dean. You think the dean's going to buy that? Right, the dean's going to laugh at us. Right. So I don't know. I wish I had an answer. I don't have an answer.
Cool. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I'm sure they'll stick around for a couple minutes.
Absolutely.
Privately, but thanks everyone for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.